They say silence is golden, but in relationships, silence can be power. The moment a man pulls back, not out of anger, but with calm, stoic detachment, it shifts the entire dynamic. This isn't about playing games. It's about understanding how your presence and your absence impacts her emotionally and psychologically. When you stop texting, calling, or chasing, she notices almost instantly. It doesn't matter how subtle your silence is. She feels it deep in her gut. Women are emotionally tuned in on a level that most men underestimate. They are highly perceptive of emotional energy, attention, tone, and even the absence of engagement. And when a man who was once consistent in his presence, his voice, his check-ins, and his emotional investment suddenly becomes quiet, it sends shockwaves through her emotional radar. She might not react outwardly at first. She might even pretend like she hasn't noticed, but make no mistake, internally she's on high alert. This shift hits harder than any words you could say. Why? Because your silence is unexpected. Most men in her past may have begged, argued, or tried to win her over when things started feeling distant. But you're different. You didn't fight. You didn't chase. You didn't explain yourself or ask her why she's being cold. You just went silent. That single move changes everything. It disrupts the emotional rhythm she had gotten used to, the rhythm where you were available, responsive, and emotionally open. And now, that rhythm is broken. The energy she used to feed off of the validation, the reassurance, the comfort of knowing you're always there suddenly disappears. And with that disappearance comes confusion, curiosity, and even panic. Silence, especially from a man who once gave attention, is a powerful form of psychological contrast. She starts to notice not only that something has changed, but that it has changed asterisk without explanation asterisk. That lack of clarity drives her insane because uncertainty breeds obsession. Her mind starts racing. Why isn't he texting like before? Is he upset? Did I push him too far? Is he seeing someone else? These thoughts aren't born out of love necessarily. They're born out of disruption. You've created an emotional void, and voids demand to be filled. But you're not giving her the tools to fill it. You're not giving her information, feedback, or even a hint. You've just retreated into stillness. And that's where the real power lies. When a woman realizes that your attention is no longer on her. When she feels that emotional spotlight shift away, it unsettles her. If she had started to take you for granted, if she had started to feel like your presence was a given, your silence shatters that illusion. It reminds her that your attention is not a permanent resource. It is something she must earn, something she must now chase. In that moment, she goes from feeling in control to feeling uncertain. And that shift in emotional power is what makes your silence louder than any argument, louder than any grand gesture, louder than any dramatic confrontation. Silence removes the noise, and in that space, all she can hear is the echo of your absence. When you go silent, something unexpected begins to happen in her mind. Without the constant feedback loop of conversation, attention, or even basic acknowledgement, her thoughts begin to turn inward. She starts to reflect, not just on you, but on her own behavior, her own words, and her own choices. See, when you're consistently communicating with someone, especially in a romantic or emotionally involved dynamic, there's a rhythm that forms. There's a pattern of interaction, a mutual exchange of energy. When that pattern is suddenly disrupted by your silence, her brain doesn't just shrug it off. It scrambles to make sense of it. That's human nature. We are hardwired to seek meaning, to look for patterns, to explain the unexplainable. And women, especially with their emotionally attuned instincts, will dive deep into introspection the moment your presence is withdrawn. She starts replaying conversations in her head, word for word. She starts questioning whether she said something wrong, did something off, or gave off the wrong energy. She begins overanalyzing the last text, the last call, the last time you saw each other. This isn't just about curiosity, it's about emotional correction. Your silence acts like a mirror, reflecting back to her every moment where she may have failed to appreciate you, ignored your effort, or took your presence for granted. It triggers something powerful, self-awareness. And self-awareness in relationships can be uncomfortable, especially when it's forced upon you by someone else's emotional distance. She might not show it on the outside. She might act like she's unaffected. She might post like everything's normal, but behind that curated mask, she's unraveling. The silence makes her question her assumptions that you'd always be there, that she held the upper hand, or that your feelings were guaranteed. When you go quiet, she doesn't just lose your words. She loses a sense of emotional safety, and that loss creates internal chaos. Her ego starts to battle her vulnerability. One part of her might want to blame you, label you as distant or cold. But another part is forced to ask, did I push him away? That internal conflict creates emotional pressure, and emotional pressure has to go somewhere. It often spills into obsession, regret, confusion, and eventually realization. She starts noticing all the ways you were consistent, all the small things you did that once felt mundane but now feel significant in their absence. That good morning text you always sent, it meant more than she realized. That way you listened without judgment, that space you held when she vented about her day, now that it's missing, its value becomes magnified. The irony is that in your silence, you're saying more than you ever did with words. You're showing her what life is like without your presence. And without having to lift a finger, you've forced her into an emotional confrontation with herself. And this is where the shift truly happens. Because once reflection begins, it's nearly impossible to stop. The brain wants resolution. It wants to know why things changed, what went wrong, and how to get back to that emotional equilibrium. But here's the kicker. You haven't given her that closure. You haven't explained, justified, or opened the door. That lack of clarity fuels her curiosity and accelerates her reflection. You've removed the usual outlets of resolution. No arguments, no discussions, no draw. Not emotional exchanges. Just silence. And that silence becomes a psychological cliffhanger. You're not punishing her. You're not being manipulative. You're simply reclaiming your emotional space. But from her perspective, your quietness is a storm of unanswered questions. It's an emotional vacuum that demands introspection. And the more she reflects, the more she sees what she didn't before. Not only who you were in her life, but how she may have mishandled your presence. The man who once made her feel seen, heard, and valued is no longer extending that energy, and she's left alone with the weight of her own actions. That's the true power of going quiet. It's not just about removing your voice. It's about shifting her entire emotional narrative without uttering a single word. When you go quiet, you're demonstrating something deeply powerful: emotional control. Many men believe that in order to maintain power or attraction, they need to be constantly available, responsive, and emotionally present. They believe that showing vulnerability or neediness equates to emotional depth or intimacy. But the truth is, the opposite is often true. Emotional control is one of the most compelling traits a man can exhibit, particularly in relationships. When you're silent, it's not because you're angry, insecure, or trying to manipulate the situation. It's because you've mastered your emotions. You've removed the urgency to explain yourself, the compulsion to chase, and the anxiety that many men experience when they feel emotionally disconnected. Women, on the other hand, are not conditioned in the same way. Their emotional responses tend to be more reactive and immediate. So, when a man goes quiet, especially when he was once emotionally present, it forces a woman to confront the contrast between her own emotional reactions and his composed state. The more emotionally reactive she is, the more obvious it becomes how emotionally controlled you are in comparison. You're not chasing her validation, and you're not scrambling to prove your worth. You simply step back, allowing her to feel the distance, the absence, and the emotional tension that naturally arises from that. That creates a power imbalance in the dynamic. The woman may have once felt like she had control or influence, but now she's left with uncertainty and, potentially, a feeling of helplessness. In this space, she starts to realize that you aren't emotionally dependent on her. You're not looking to her for reassurance. This realization can be deeply unsettling for her, but it's also incredibly attractive. The power of emotional control doesn't lie in acting indifferent or cold, though. It's not about creating distance just for the sake of being distant. Emotional control is about not allowing external factors, including her reactions, to dictate your sense of self. When you go quiet, you're showing her that you don't need her to complete you, validate you, or make you feel secure. You are secure in yourself, and this is the most potent form of masculinity, independence from emotional highs and lows based on someone else's actions. This emotional steadiness creates an air of mystery. She doesn't know what you're thinking. She doesn't know how you feel, and that is a stark contrast to the usual dynamic where she might expect that you're always available to her needs, always there to respond to her cues. What she doesn't understand, at first, is that this silence comes from a place of self-assurance. You are not reacting to her silence or her emotional distance, because you don't need her attention to feel whole. You've got your own life, your own ambitions, and your own priorities. In that silence, you aren't begging her for answers or asking her why things have changed. You're just continuing on with your own path. This doesn't come from a place of arrogance or superiority, but from a deep sense of emotional self-sufficiency, and it's exactly this that draws her in. The absence of emotional neediness, the absence of desperation, is what creates desire. The longer you remain quiet, the more she starts to realize just how much she may have taken your emotional stability for granted. She may have once thought that you would always be the one to chase, to keep the connection alive. But now, in your silence, she starts to see how her actions have contributed to this shift, and how your emotional control has shifted the power balance between you both. Emotional control also requires immense patience. Most people, especially when dealing with the emotional ebb and flow of relationships, are not naturally patient. They want to fix things immediately, seek resolution, and avoid discomfort. But the man who can sit in that discomfort without needing to fix things right away holds a power that is hard to ignore. This patience becomes a psychological game changer. The more you remain silent, the more you show her that your emotional world isn't at her mercy. She begins to see that you're capable of maintaining emotional peace without needing constant reassurance. And that's the key. It's not about playing games. It's about demonstrating the maturity, strength, and emotional intelligence to allow things to unfold without your constant interference. The moment you step back and stop reacting emotionally, you force her to confront her own feelings and behaviors. You've essentially placed the emotional responsibility back onto her. She has to decide how she will react to your silence. She has to figure out what it means and why it's happening, and in doing so, she becomes increasingly absorbed in your emotional world, seeking to understand you, to unravel the mystery of your emotional control. In a world where emotional instability is so common, emotional control becomes a rare and valuable trait. The moment you go quiet, you show her that you're not like most men chasing validation, seeking emotional comfort, or constantly requiring affirmation. You're a man who can navigate his emotions with strength and composure, and that emotional resilience is one of the most magnetic qualities you can possess. The longer you remain silent, the more this emotional composure becomes a benchmark of your masculinity. Your silence, driven by emotional control, creates a powerful dynamic. It forces her to question her own emotional state and realize that her ability to affect your mood or your emotional security is limited. And it's in this space of emotional self-sufficiency that real desire begins to grow. When you go silent, she begins to miss the small things, the seemingly insignificant moments that once went unnoticed. It's often in the absence of something that we truly begin to appreciate its value, and for her, your presence was woven into the fabric of her daily routine, even in ways she may not have consciously acknowledged. The way you'd check in during the day, send a thoughtful message, or just listen without judgment when she vented about the trivialities of life. All of these little actions might have once seemed like routine or even predictable. But the moment you stop doing them, the silence draws attention to what was once there and is now gone. It's not just about missing your physical presence. It's about realizing that a void has been created where once there was consistency, connection, and emotional warmth. These small things you provided were not just acts of kindness. They were emotional cues, markers of connection that helped her feel seen and heard. When you would text her in the morning, it wasn't just a message. It was a reassurance that you were thinking about her. It was a gesture that said, "You matter to me, and I'm here, sharing my thoughts with you." Those small, everyday moments are the foundation of intimacy, and when you remove them, she's left to reflect on how much they actually meant. This doesn't happen immediately. At first, she might not even realize what's missing. But after a period of silence, when you've stopped reaching out, stopped engaging, and stopped investing emotionally, she'll start to feel a sense of absence, one that grows as time passes without your usual touch points. She might even start to feel disconnected, like the emotional thread that once tied you both together has been severed. That's when the true weight of those small things hits her. In her mind, those moments weren't just mundane rituals. They were signs of your investment, proof that you cared enough to check in, to reach out, to include her in your thoughts. Once gone, it's as if the emotional climate she took for granted is no longer there to comfort her. She starts to notice that your attention isn't something she can expect, that your emotional availability is not guaranteed. What once felt constant now feels fragile, and in that fragility, she realizes how important those small gestures were to her emotional security. Your silence forces her to recognize her own dependency on your emotional consistency. It's a shift in perspective, that might not be immediately welcomed. She might resist the discomfort of this realization, but it's undeniable. The absence of those small moments creates a space that she can no longer ignore. Furthermore, it's not just about missing your attention in general. It's about missing the way you made her feel. Women are often drawn to men who are attentive in subtle ways, who notice the things that others might overlook. You didn't just send generic messages or go through the motions. You brought a sense of intentionality to your interactions. Maybe you remembered the little things she liked, her favorite song, the way she took her coffee, the funny inside joke that made her laugh. You personalized your communication in a way that made her feel special, unique, and valued. These little details, over time, built a connection that went beyond surface-level attraction. And now, when you're silent, she's left to reflect on those moments, the ones where you made her feel important, seen, and understood. The more you withhold that kind of attention, the more she starts to yearn for it. This is the power of emotional presence, not in grand gestures, but in the little things that form the foundation of intimacy. When those things are no longer there, she feels the void on a deeper level than she might have anticipated. It's not just the absence of a message. It's the absence of the feeling that came with that message. When you reach out consistently, even with something simple, like a thoughtful question or a comment that shows you're paying attention to her life, you reinforce her sense of being emotionally cared for. But once that's gone, it becomes glaringly obvious. She feels the distance between you, not just physically, but emotionally. And with that distance comes an aching desire to reclaim what she lost, to get back to that space where she felt valued and understood. Your silence causes her to rethink what she took for granted. She may have assumed that your attention was always going to be there, that your emotional investment would remain constant. But when you withdraw, it forces her to confront the reality that nothing is guaranteed. The absence of those small, thoughtful gestures makes her realize how much of a role they played in her emotional stability. It's easy to get used to someone's presence when it's always available. But when that presence is removed, even for a short time, it forces her to confront the fact that she might have relied too much on those gestures to feel secure. She may not have appreciated them fully when they were being given, but now, in their absence, she feels the weight of their importance, and this is where the emotional shift occurs. What was once taken for granted is now deeply missed. The silence brings with it a profound sense of loss, the loss of connection, the loss of the little things that built trust, and the loss of the emotional comfort she once felt in your presence. This realization sets the stage for deeper reflection on her part, where she might begin to assess her own role in the dynamic and wonder how she could have contributed to the situation. Silence creates an undeniable tension. It's an energy that is felt more than it's understood, and it often triggers a response that is far more intense than anything words could invoke. When you stop engaging emotionally, when you stop making yourself available in the way you once did, the very act of withdrawing creates a palpable tension between you both. This tension is magnetic because it's unresolved. It's like a puzzle without a solution, an open loop that demands closure. And as much as she might try to pretend it doesn't bother her, this unresolved tension is what keeps her coming back to the situation mentally and emotionally. It becomes a constant undercurrent in her thoughts. She begins to fixate on it, trying to decipher what's happening, why you've pulled away, and what it means for her. This is where the real power of silence lies. It forces her to confront her own emotions in a way that's not always comfortable. The tension doesn't just make her anxious, It makes her want to fix things. Human beings are naturally inclined to resolve tension, especially when it's in a relationship. People are conditioned to seek out harmony, to remove discord, and to bring things back to a state of emotional equilibrium. But you're not providing the answers she expects. You're not rushing in to smooth things over, to reassure her, or to explain yourself. The silence you've imposed makes her feel like she's in the dark, and that darkness can be consuming. When a woman feels uncertain, it often leads to a deeper emotional response: curiosity, frustration, anxiety, and sometimes even desperation. She can't help but wonder what's going on in your mind, what you're thinking, and why you've suddenly become unreachable. The more she thinks about it, the more intense her emotional reaction becomes. She may start seeking explanations in places that didn't exist before, looking for clues in past conversations, rereading messages, or even analyzing your behavior for any subtle signals. The silence creates an emotional void that her mind will naturally try to fill, and in doing so, it fuels her obsession with finding answers. The tension also works on another level. It creates desire. When she feels this emotional distance from you, it forces her to reconsider her own feelings. She begins to miss the closeness, the emotional connection, and the attention she once took for granted. But now it's no longer available to her in the same way, and this shift causes a craving for what's been taken away. Desire doesn't just come from being given what you want. It often grows from not having access to something that once felt like a given. The absence of your emotional engagement acts as a mirror to the emotional fulfillment she once experienced when you were present, attentive, and consistent. The more you withhold that, the more she begins to desire it, often more intensely than she did when it was freely available. The tension created by your silence becomes the fuel for an emotional pull that is hard for her to ignore. And the more she desires it, the more she will work to regain access to it, even if she doesn't fully understand why. This desire is not simply for you as a person. It's for the emotional space you once occupied in her life, the way you made her feel seen, heard, and valued. When you're silent, she starts to crave that feeling again, and in doing so, she becomes more emotionally invested. Her need for emotional resolution turns into a desire for emotional connection, and that connection is something she can only feel with you. The silence creates a vacuum that she subconsciously wants to fill. The longer you remain silent, the stronger the tension grows, and the deeper her emotional need becomes. She will begin to seek out ways to break the silence, either by initiating contact, trying to talk through the tension, or attempting to decipher your behavior. But with every attempt to fill the void, the silence remains. It's this persistence of the tension, the inability to find closure, that keeps her emotionally hooked, even if she doesn't fully understand why she's so drawn to you in that moment. The desire created by this tension is also tied to a deeper psychological phenomenon, the fear of loss. People often don't realize how much they value something until it's threatened. When you're silent, you become emotionally distant in a way that makes her feel like she might lose you, lose your attention, your presence, or even your affection. This fear of losing what she once had creates an urgency in her that wasn't there before. She begins to realize that her emotional security, which she may have once taken for granted, is now in jeopardy. The tension amplifies this fear and makes it more difficult for her to simply walk away. Instead, she finds herself pulled back in, trying to figure out what happened, trying to understand what went wrong, and ultimately trying to regain the emotional connection she's beginning to fear she might lose. The longer this tension persists, the more her fear of loss deepens, and the stronger her emotional response becomes. She may try to deny it, to act unaffected, but the truth is, the fear of losing you becomes one of the most compelling drivers of her desire to reconnect. What you've created through your silence is not just emotional confusion. It's a whole psychological dynamic that forces her to confront her own vulnerabilities. The longer you stay silent, the more this dynamic intensifies, drawing her back to you again and again. She's not just seeking closure, she's seeking emotional resolution. The silence has put her in a state of emotional suspense, where she's both drawn to and frustrated by the tension. This unresolved emotional state keeps her mind spinning, caught in the cycle of wanting answers, but not receiving them. And it's this cycle that can lead to an obsession with you, because the silence you've imposed makes her realize, sometimes more acutely than ever, that you are the key to resolving the emotional tension she now feels. When you go quiet, it forces her to reflect on her own actions, decisions, and the role she plays in the dynamic between you both. Often, in relationships, people become so immersed in the daily flow of emotions, interactions, and routines that they don't fully take a step back to see their own behavior objectively. The moment you withdraw, it creates a pause, a break in the usual emotional exchange. This pause doesn't just leave an empty space. It forces her to think, and not just think about the situation at hand, but about her entire approach to you and to the relationship. She starts to wonder, what did I do wrong? Why is he suddenly distant? Did I say something that pushed him away? This reflection isn't immediate. At first, she might be defensive, dismissing the change in your behavior as something temporary or unimportant. But the longer the silence persists, the more her mind begins to circle around these questions. It's not just about analyzing the immediate past. It's about reassessing everything, the way she communicates with you, the way she expresses her emotions, and even the way she has been treating you. This period of silence allows her to step outside of the emotional current and gain some distance, something that can be incredibly revealing. She begins to see how her actions, perhaps unknowingly, may have contributed to the growing distance between you. Maybe she took you for granted, failed to appreciate your gestures, or assumed you would always be there, responding to her emotional needs without question. This type of reflection is powerful because it brings self-awareness to the surface. It doesn't just allow her to see what you've done, it forces her to look inward and realize what she may have been neglecting in the relationship. This kind of introspection, while painful, can lead to a shift in her perception of you. When you withdraw and stop offering emotional validation, you create an environment in which she is compelled to take ownership of her role in the situation. This realization can be deeply uncomfortable, especially if she realizes she may have been emotionally neglectful or overly focused on her own needs. The silence you've imposed brings into focus the things she might have ignored or brushed off, how she responded to your emotional cues, how she might have been dismissive or nonchalant about your feelings, or how she may have overlooked the small but significant ways you tried to connect with her. Suddenly, she begins to see the imbalance in the emotional give and take and recognizes that her own behavior may have been a part of the problem. This reflection doesn't just come from a place of guilt or regret. It's often a moment of growth, where she begins to see you in a different light. She realizes that you're not the kind of person who will just put up with emotional neglect or constantly chase validation. You've shown that you're capable of walking away when necessary, of asserting your boundaries and maintaining emotional integrity. This kind of behavior forces her to reevaluate her assumptions about you, about the stability of your emotions, the strength of your character, and the importance of mutual respect in the relationship. In a way, your silence has become a lesson for her, and the longer it goes on, the more deeply she reflects on her own role in the dynamic. One of the most profound impacts of this reflection is that it shifts her from a place of external focus, focusing on your actions, your words, your behavior, to an internal focus where she starts asking herself, how did I contribute to this? What can I do differently? This type of reflection is not always easy, because it challenges her ego and forces her to take responsibility for her actions, something that many people find difficult to do, especially in emotionally charged situations. However, when she finally starts to connect the dots, she may experience a shift in how she views the relationship and how she views you. The silence has provided her with an opportunity to step back, and now she's beginning to see the larger picture, a picture where her own behavior is just as important as yours in maintaining a healthy, balanced relationship. In this space, she might begin to acknowledge things she hadn't seen before, small signs of emotional inconsistency, miscommunication, or moments where she may have failed to truly consider your needs. The realization might be humbling, but it's also an opportunity for growth. She's no longer just looking at you and wondering why you've gone silent. Now, she's looking at herself and asking, what have I done to contribute to this situation? This process of self-reflection can be difficult, but it's also what leads to a deeper understanding of the emotional dynamics between you both. By withdrawing and remaining silent, you've created a space for her to really think about the relationship, not just on a surface level, but in a deeper, more meaningful way. As the silence continues, this internal shift becomes even more pronounced. She starts to understand that silence doesn't just mean that you've shut down emotionally or are punishing her for something. Instead, it shows that you've reached a point where you're no longer willing to engage in a relationship that doesn't meet your emotional needs. This understanding might lead to a change in her approach. She may start becoming more introspective, more conscious of her actions, and more focused on building a healthier dynamic. The silence has forced her to reassess everything, from how she communicates with you to how she shows up emotionally in the relationship. It's a powerful catalyst for change, and it doesn't just make her reflect on the relationship in general. It makes her reflect on herself as well. Eventually, this period of self-reflection and emotional reassessment could lead to a deeper appreciation for you. As she processes everything, she might come to understand that your withdrawal wasn't about punishing her. It was about establishing boundaries and demonstrating emotional self-sufficiency. You weren't chasing her approval or desperately trying to maintain the connection. Instead, you showed that you value yourself enough to create space when things are off balance. This realization may cause her to reevaluate her own behavior and, in turn, begin to make changes that reflect a deeper respect for you, your emotional needs, and the dynamic between you both. So when you go quiet, it's not just about retreating, it's about reclaiming your power. Your silence isn't an absence, it's a presence that demands to be felt. It forces her to look within, to examine the emotional landscape she's created, and to confront truths she might have avoided. And in that quiet you communicate something louder than words ever could, that you are not a man who begs to be seen. You are a man who steps back and lets your absence speak. And when she finally realizes what that silence means, it won't just shake her. It will change the way she sees you forever.